Okay, welcome to the next tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at all things physical. If you're an Olivia Newton-John fan, you might want to put Let's Get Physical on in the background just so you can jam out. We're going to look at physical render. We're going to look at physically accurate lighting. And we're also going to look at the physical camera. And so I might split this up into a couple parts. But to start with, I've got this like crappy still life setup, but I wanted to just have a few options in here in terms of surfaces, right? So there's something that's rectilinear, there's something with curvature, and then there's this more blobby asteroid object that I created using the sculpt tools, and we'll look at those later. And then, right, we have this seamless backdrop, and the seamless backdrop is basically just a polygon object dropped into a subdivision surface. So if I turn the subdivision surface off, you can see and go into polygons mode, right? It's just, a set of polygons. In this tutorial, we're going to start with it pretty shallow, but then we're going to go ahead and, we will scale it both out in width and then scale it back in depth. Because one of the things that you can do with the physical camera is you can have depth of field. And so that means, right, you can say, I only want a portion of my image to be focused, and there's a bunch of other effects that you can do with that. But we need to be able to have our objects spread out in space away from the camera to do that. So I'm just going to go back here. I'm going to turn this back on. Also note, I do have 3 different materials here. So, right, you can just change the order if you want like a totally black backdrop, if you want a gray backdrop, or a white backdrop. And on some of these objects, I've also included a couple. I've just already applied 2 of these materials on there. I believe it's material 5 and material 3. And you can switch between them in order to adjust those colors if you so desire. Okay, so let's get started. So to start with, we have no lights in the scene whatsoever. And so we're going to go ahead and create one. And we're going to start by, rather than creating an omni light, we're going to create an area light. And unless you're using lights that are meant to be at like a really long distance, I highly suggest using area lights when you can, if your computer isn't fussing too much about rendering them, because they're much more accurate to the real world. And they allow you to be visible in the render and everything. So let's go ahead and create an area light. When I create an area light, I'm going to make sure I have the move tools selected as well. You'll see that I get this massive white boundary, and that is the shape of the area light itself. So this light is huge, right? Compared to our objects, this is a massive light. Now you'll also notice that where it's set. So what I want to do is I'm going to render this right now. And I should have progressive set. And so you can see that when this renders, there's this black line that runs through the middle of this scene. And then it's lit on this side and this side. And what's happening is the area light emits light in almost 180 degrees from both surfaces. And so right now we're getting light streaming out in one direction this way, streaming out in the other direction that way. And then we have this seam where there's no light, which is right on the edge of the thing, right? And you can see where it's set. So the first thing we want to do is whenever we're using area lights, we want to make sure that that one of the faces is aiming at the objects that we want that to aim at, right? If I was to, oops, I thought I had the light selected. Make sure you have the light selected. Right, if I pull this forward, you'll see that, right, now I'm lighting, directly from the front. And so there's probably not going to be any shadows whatsoever. I also don't have shadows turned on yet. Right, but so, okay, so one of the things that we want to make sure we do is have the light positioned where we want it to be positioned. And we want to scale it to something that makes sense. Now, sometimes there are lights that are this large, close to objects, but it's pretty rare. So let's go ahead and make this a smaller shape. And to do that, I can just click on these orange little sliders, right? And I can make this light whatever size I want it to be. right? And this is just the default size and shape of this light. And if I rotate my view a bit, right, you can see this. Now, there's a whole bunch of settings we haven't set yet. Notice that also, like, I'm not getting a whole lot of light there because this light, the way the light is coming out of this object. And so as soon as I pull this up and I get the entire light up above the surface, it's going to get much brighter, right? Because light is coming out at an angle. Okay. So I've got this light, but let's go ahead and we need to make some changes to some settings. So this may be true on your window, on your machine as well, but the details is the first thing that's shown. Let's go back to general. And so we're going to, with the type is area, we're going to do area shadows as well. And we're going to leave everything else just as it is for right now. We're going to try and use a really neutral, even light to start with. Right, so I've got shadows on. If I render this, even though I'm looking at this from the side, right, I should see these shadows now come off of all of my objects and flow up the surface of this thing. And you'll notice that, right, most of these shadows are pretty soft, especially as they get further away. And that's because this light is so close. Right, if I pull this light a little bit further away, right, my shadows are all going to get harder, much like they would with an omni light. It's basically, the same physics are at work. So I'm going to undo that movement further away. And so now what we need to do is we need to go and click on our Details tab. Because what we haven't really been dealing with yet, most recently, is that light diminishes over distance, right? It gets, a light that seems bright close up. If you've ever used a flashlight at night, right, you can see something, a few inches away, it's full brightness. If you aim it further away, it gets a lot dimmer. The same thing if you've ever used a video projector, right? Like, yeah, you can make it super huge if you aim it at a really far distant object, but the light intensity is going to be greatly reduced, right? And then if you go closer to your wall or whatever you're projecting on, the image is going to be smaller, but it's going to be a lot more intense. And there's a rule or a law where the rule is that light intensity diminishes at 1 over the square of the radius of that distance, right? So it exponentially gets less bright. And so Cinema4D allows us to set that, and that setting is under here under Falloff. And Falloff says none currently, but what we want is the inverse square law, right? We want this to be physically accurate. There's other options, but we're just going to say we want this to be physically accurate. Now, initially, the radius of decay is 500 centimeters, right? And if we leave that with our light this close, with our light only about, 20, maybe 100 centimeters from the objects, and we render this, right, everything is going to be completely and totally blasted out, right? It's just so much brightness. And so that's not really what we want to do. What we want to do is we want to adjust that. And if I zoom out a bit, you'll see that what's happened when I've turned on the Falloff is I now have this sphere of intensity around me, right? And so what I can do is I can essentially adjust how bright this light is based on how far away it can illuminate things. And you'll see that, right, there is illumination past this sphere, but this allows me to very cleanly adjust the radius of decay. And so I'm going to rotate my view and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And still, I haven't changed the position of the slide. It's still going straight on. Right, but I just want to go ahead and render this. And now you can see that I have a lot more control over how bright this light is and where it's coming from and what type of shadows I can cast, right? If I want this to be the same brightness with harder shadows, what I'm going to need to do is select my light and move my light much further away from my object, right? And pull this intensity back out to about the same point, right? And so now I should have about the same intensity, but my shadows should be significantly harder, right? And you can see there's some chunkiness in in this seamless backdrop, but that's fine. We're not too worried about that right now. This is just to set up lighting, right? And so now if I zoom in and I actually have, right, my scene in view, right, then you can see that I'm getting good brightness across here and my shadows are harder than they were previously. Okay. So that is how you can start to create a physically accurate light. So let's talk a little bit more about area lights in general. So I've got, my setting here, and I've got this light, and I've got it in this rectangle shape, right? Now this would be great if I was trying to say, create like a fluorescent tube, right? A fluorescent tube typically emits light in a long rectangular shape. Oftentimes there are two of them, so I might even want to go so far as to hold down Control, click and drag to create a second light, right? And then I've got like this standard fluorescent, tube setup, and you'll notice when I do that, right, the intensity is going to be twice as bright, right? Because these are positively interfering with each other. And so here I might want to take both of these lights and reduce that intensity a touch. But in this case, right, I'm just going to go ahead and undo those last steps, just so I have just this one shape. Okay, so under my Details tab, if I have my light selected, I can go down here, and one of the things I can change is area shape. So if I change my area shape, I can change it to disk, line, sphere, cylinder, cylinder perpendicular, cube, hemisphere, and then object or spline, right? And so object or spline, I can basically make any object a light. You have to be careful. You only want to do that when it's like, what am I trying to say? When it's really necessary. But let's go ahead and just go to disk, right? And right now I have this set to 5 centimeters by 136. Why don't we just make it 136 by 136? Actually, it's going to be huge. Let's make it 20 by 20. Right? So usually it's a round light. So the next thing that I have here is my fall-off angle. Now, something we had that I talked about briefly when I started was, right, when we created this initially, there was this black line right through all of this, and there was light on either side. And that's set by the fall-off angle. So I'm going to go ahead and create a floor. And I'm going to shrink, I'm going to select my light again. I'm going to shrink this intensity a little bit. And I'm going to render this and see if it, okay, perfect. So when I render this, right, now you can see that edge, and you can see the two bright spots on either side of it, right? That's because I have this fall-off angle set to 180. Let's go ahead and reduce that fall-off angle. 180, I believe, is the largest fall-off angle you can have. Let's reduce that fall-off angle to, say, 60 degrees. I'm going to go ahead and render this again. So now you can see, and it's much harder to see, that I have this cone of light on either side. Right? What I'm doing is, by making this 60 degrees, I'm essentially creating this, and we're only seeing a cross-section of it, but a three-dimensional cone of light coming out either side of this light. Right? So if I pull this down so that it bisects the floor, right, you can see I get a little bit of light there. Right? I want to make sure the light is visible on the surface in the preview. If I do this and I zoom in on this so you can actually see it, right? So you can see I'm kind of roughly intersecting the floor, and that looks really crazy, right? But I'm getting this like much narrower beam of light in either direction. This essentially allows me to use area lights as spotlights, right? So you can imagine all this light's kind of emanating from that disk that I've created, and it's doing so in a conic shape. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to lift this up. Okay, so I've lifted this up some, right? We know that this is, that we've changed this. So what I want to do is I'm going to rotate this view. I'm going to rotate, sorry, this object until it's pointing up and down. right? Because usually, a lot of times we have lights from above. So now when I render this, you'll see that I'm getting this spotlight effect, right? Now, if I go ahead and if I was to adjust my fall-off angle to 120 degrees, then right, I'm going to get a much bigger circle, and you can also see there's the full intensity and then the intensity that falls off on the sides. Now, if I go out to 180 and render this, right, now I have, still about the same center of brightness, but a much broader fall off, right? I get that gradient that goes much further. And so this allows me to use this one type of light in a variety of different settings. I'm going to set this back to 120 degrees. Okay. Now, there's some other options down here in terms of samples and add grain, which is slow. We're not going to worry about samples. We're just going to leave that at the default. We're not going to add grain. However, there's several options here, right? One is show in viewport. If I do that, it just fills this in so I can see this as an object in my scene. If I do show and render, then when I render this out, I will also see that disk, right, of light in the scene. And so if I say was to use temperature and adjust this to be like a little bit warmer and render this, right, this is actually going to be the same color as my light as well. And notice some of the ways the fall off, like what happens to the color as this intensity falls off. And think about how, if you've ever like looked at lights that way too. So I'm going to select my light again. Right, if I pull this further up off the floor and render this again, right, you'll see that I start to get a lot less intensity in the center, and it still spreads further out to the sides. Okay, let's go back to our details. And so the other thing that is really important, and it depends, right? Sometimes the reason it has this option to show in reflection or not show in reflection is because it sometimes you want that, but right, typically you want this light to be shown in your reflection on any of your objects that are reflective, because it will make it look more real. And then below that, right, there's the fall off and anything else down here. This use gradient is another option where you can basically manually control how the fall off happens. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull our light over our scene. And then let's take this view and hit H so that we are actually seeing our scene. And you'll notice that that floor is really interfering with the backdrop. And so I'm going to go ahead and just delete the floor for the time being. We don't need it. And then right now this light is way too intense. Now I'm going to lift it up a little bit in the scene, just to reduce that intensity a touch, and pull it forward a little bit as well, right? You can see how, some of that intensity is now going behind that backdrop, or really hitting that back surface. And so I'm just going to go ahead and pull this forward a little bit so there aren't shadows on the front of the objects. I'm going to go ahead and just rotate my view a touch and give this a quick render just to see what we get. Okay. So far so good. That looks pretty great. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and rotate my camera and see if I can see the light. There it is, right? So here is the light visible in my reflections, right? I do have specular turned on here and my reflection is not very high. But if I go ahead and go to Material 5 and make some of those adjustments, right now, I have my global reflection brightness set pretty low, and I have my specular strength set pretty high. So I'm going to drop my specular strength down to 0. And I'm going to increase this reflection strength, reflection brightness, right? And then let's just go ahead and increase this pretty much. It's going to look like a metal object, but that's fine. All right, and so now I can kind of see the light in there. right? Let's see if I can rotate my view a little bit better to see if there's a better way that I can get that light in the scene. Okay, so this is the light up here, right? And you can see that, it's not very bright. And so one of the things that we can do is if we select our light, we have this visibility multiplier, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and increase this to 1000% so that it's obvious what's happening, right? So now I've increased that visibility multiplier to 1000%. And now I've got this, anywhere this light was, it's become a much stronger specular highlight. And so that's something that, right, if you're like, well, I can see the light, but it looks like a really dim object. All you need to do is take this visibility multiplier and increase that, and you can get a much brighter highlight from that light. Right?